December 11th, 1941. Berlin, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Inside the Kroll Opera House, which has replaced the burned-down Reichstag, the air is stifling. Outside, the winter sky is the color of lead, but inside, under the glare of dozens of spotlights and news cameras, the temperature is tropical. In the front row, sweat is trickling down the foreheads of generals under their peaked caps, yet no one dares to move. At the podium stands the man who holds all of Europe in fear. Adolf Hitler has been speaking for 88 minutes. His voice, hoarse and strained, echoes off the walls. He waves his arms, cursing Jews, Masons, and world plutocrats. But this time, his rage is not directed at London, and not at Moscow. 6,000 kilometers away, in Washington, D.C., it is early morning. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is just having his first coffee. Congress is waking up. America is still reeling from the deep, traumatic shock of Pearl Harbor, which happened just 4 days ago. The country is furious, but that fury has a clear vector. It is aimed at Japan, at the Pacific. No one in Washington is looking at Europe this morning. And at this precise moment, Hitler does something that historians will later call the greatest gift the Allies ever received. He pauses theatrically, scans the room, and utters the words that sign the death warrant of his 1,000-year Reich. Germany declares war on the United States of America. The hall explodes. It's not just applause. It is ecstasy. The Reichstag deputies leap from their seats, arms raised in the party salute. They scream. They stomp their feet, their faces distorted with euphoria. It seems to them that their Führer has outplayed everyone again, that he has once again challenged fate and won. But if you could stop time in that moment, if you could look into the eyes of the professional military strategists sitting in that same room, you wouldn't see joy. You would see pure, undiluted terror. Because they know how to do the math. They know what the newspapers aren't saying. They know that the Wehrmacht is currently freezing to death in the Russian snows outside Moscow. They know the Luftwaffe has no strategic bombers capable of reaching New York and returning. They know Hitler has no surface fleet to land a single soldier on the American coast. To declare war on the U.S. at this moment, with an open front in the east, was the equivalent of putting a gun to your temple and pulling the trigger, hoping the bullet would ricochet and kill your enemy. This decision seems like madness. Suicide. The mistake of a psychopath who has finally lost touch with reality. That's exactly how it is often taught in school textbooks. Hitler simply went mad with power and delusions of grandeur. But that is too simple an explanation, and it is fundamentally wrong. On that day, December 11th, Hitler was not insane. He had a plan. He had logic. Twisted, cold, built on false premises, but ironclad internal logic. He believed this step was the only way to save Germany from slow strangulation. He thought he was seizing the strategic initiative. In reality, he had just woken a volcano that would bury his empire under a layer of ash. To understand why he pulled that trigger, we need to rewind the tape. 4 days back. To the moment when the world turned upside down, and Hitler literally slept through it. Let's transport ourselves 7,000 kilometers to the east, to the dark, snow-covered forests of East Prussia. Here, hidden among swamps and ancient trees, lies the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, the Führer's headquarters. This isn't the luxurious dictator's palace often shown in movies. It is a damp, gloomy complex of concrete and steel, draped in camouflage netting. The air here is always stale, smelling of diesel from generators, dampness, and the cheap tobacco of the guard soldiers. Evening, December 7th, 1941. In Washington, it is 1 p.m., and radio stations are interrupting broadcasts with breaking news. In Pearl Harbor, the skeletons of battleships are burning. America is in panic. But inside the Wolf's Lair, there is silence. Hitler is having dinner with his adjutants. No one called him from Tokyo. The Emperor of Japan didn't think it necessary to warn his main European ally. The Tripartite Pact, which Goebbels' propaganda was so proud of, turned out to be a complete fiction. Two totalitarian regimes were acting like blind moles, digging tunnels in different directions, unable to hear each other. And here, a scene worthy of the theater of the absurd plays out. Hitler, a man aspiring to world domination, learns about the start of a world war not from a secret intelligence report, and not from an ambassador. His press secretary, Otto Dietrich, bursts into the room. In his hands is a trembling piece of paper. It isn't an Abwehr cipher. It's a printout of news from the British agency Reuters and the BBC. Dietrich, breathless, reports, "Mein Führer, the Japanese have attacked the American fleet in Hawaii." Hitler's first reaction? Disbelief. He thought it was a trick. Disinformation. A provocation by Churchill to drag Germany into the war. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, looked at the map of the Pacific and scoffed skeptically. The very idea that Asians could deliver such a complex and devastating blow to the white race did not fit into their racist worldview. But an hour later, official confirmation arrived, and then the mood in the bunker changed abruptly. You probably think the German generals grabbed their heads in despair, that they began to panic, realizing that the entire gigantic industrial potential of the USA was now against them. No, they started celebrating. Eyewitnesses recall that Hitler, who had looked like a walking corpse in recent weeks, sullen, hunched over, literally beamed. He slapped his hand on the table and exclaimed a phrase that today sounds like an epitaph. "Now we cannot lose the war. We have an ally who has not been conquered in 3,000 years. Champagne was ordered in the bunker. Field Marshal Keitel, chief of the High Command, hugged officers with tears in his eyes. Goebbels wrote enthusiastic passages in his diary that night about the end of American arrogance. It seemed to them like salvation. They saw the situation like this. America would now be bogged down in the Pacific for years. Roosevelt would be too busy exacting revenge on Japan to help Britain or the USSR. The flow of Lend-Lease across the Atlantic would dry up. The ocean would become free hunting grounds for German U-boats. It was the euphoria of a gambler in a casino who had lost all his chips, but suddenly saw a fistfight break out at the next table and hoped to steal the pot amidst the chaos. But in this jubilation, there was one terrifying detail that no one in the wolf's lair wanted to say out loud. It was the joy of desperation. Hitler was rejoicing not because America was weak, and not because Japan was strong. He was rejoicing because he urgently, vitally, needed to distract attention from the catastrophe that was happening right outside his bunker's doorstep. While they drank champagne in a warm concrete bag, a blizzard was raging outside. And this blizzard was covering not only East Prussia, it was burying hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who were freezing to death in the snows of Russia at that very moment. Hitler grabbed onto Pearl Harbor like a drowning man clutching a straw, because his master plan, Operation Barbarossa, had collapsed just 48 hours earlier. To understand the scale of the disaster, we need to physically feel this cold. Imagine a temperature of 35 degrees below 0 Celsius. In such frost, the synthetic oil in German engines turns into thick glue, and tanks simply won't start. Rifle bolts freeze solid. Soldiers have to urinate on them just to fire a shot. If a tanker touches the armor with a bare hand, his skin stays on the metal. These were the conditions the German army faced on December 5th, 1941. Just 48 hours before the Japanese Zeros took off from the aircraft carriers, absolute hell broke loose outside Moscow. Hitler had promised his generals that Russia would fall before the first snow. That was the foundation of the entire plan. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The Germans were so confident of victory that they hadn't even brought winter uniforms. They were carrying parade uniforms in their supply trains for a victory march through Red Square. They were so close. The advanced motorcycle reconnaissance units could see the Kremlin towers through their binoculars. Officers claimed they could see the sun glinting off the domes. Victory was within arm's reach, and suddenly, that arm was severed. On December 5th, the Soviet Union launched what seemed impossible to the German General Staff, a massive counteroffensive. From the depths of the country, from Siberia, fresh divisions arrived. These were soldiers in white camouflage, on skis, accustomed to the bitter frost. Together with new T-34 tanks, whose wide tracks didn't sink in the snow, they crashed into the frozen, exhausted, dysentery-ridden Germans. The front didn't just waver, it began to disintegrate. Legendary German generals who had conquered France and Poland, Guderian, von Bock, Brauchitsch, were in a panic. They sent telegrams to headquarters with one demand: retreat, immediately, or we lose the army. The shadow of Napoleon hung over them, the ghost of the Grande Armée of 1812, which had perished in those same snows. For Hitler, this wasn't just a military failure. It was the collapse of his entire ideological universe. He had built his power on the myth of invincibility. He had convinced the nation that Slavs were Untermensch, an inferior race, a colossus with feet of clay that would collapse from a single blow. And now, this inferior race was driving his super soldiers westward. Admit defeat at Moscow? For Hitler, that was impossible. It would mean admitting that Nazism was flawed, that the Übermensch had lost. At that moment, his psyche was looking for an exit. He needed to change the record. He needed to explain to the German people why the war hadn't ended by Christmas, as he had sworn. He couldn't say, "We lost to the Russians," but to say, "We are fighting not just Russia, but a gigantic global conspiracy involving both the Bolsheviks and American capitalists." That sounded much grander. It justified prolonging the war. It turned the shameful retreat at Moscow into just one episode of a great clash of civilizations. Hitler looked at the map. In the east, a strategic dead end. He needed a victory. Any dynamic movement. Anywhere. And then, as if on order, the news of Pearl Harbor arrives. A switch flipped in his head. If he can't take Moscow, he will flip the chessboard and start a new game. A game on a global scale. But a question arises here that torments many history buffs. Was he obligated to do this? Many still believe that Hitler declared war on the U.S. because he was bound by Allied duty under the Tripartite Pact. This is complete nonsense. And now, we will dissect this document to understand how cynically Tokyo used Berlin. Let's imagine for a minute that we are lawyers in the office of Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Reich Minister of Foreign Affairs. The original pact lies before us. If you take a magnifying glass and read Article 3, you will see one key condition. The pact obligated the countries to assist each other with military force only if one of them was attacked by a power not currently involved in the war. I repeat, if attacked. Pearl Harbor was not an attack on Japan. It was Japan attacking the U.S. From the standpoint of international law, Tokyo was the aggressor. That meant Berlin could have quietly sat back, expressed deep concern, patted the Japanese on the back, but stayed out of the war. Moreover, Hitler had the perfect diplomatic excuse. Japan didn't just strike first. They did it without warning their best friend. In diplomacy, this is considered a betrayal and a slap in the face. Ribbentrop understood this perfectly. He even tried to hint to Hitler. Mein Führer, the text of the treaty gives us every right to stay on the sidelines. Any rational politician would have used this loophole. Stalin would have. Churchill would have. But Hitler didn't think in terms of jurisprudence. He thought in terms of gangster prestige. For him, standing aside while his ally delivered such a powerful blow meant showing weakness. It meant admitting that Japan was waging war more boldly and successfully than Germany. His inflated ego couldn't allow that. He wanted to be the one dictating history, not the one reading it in the morning papers. And there was another point. Hitler hated it when events unfolded without his knowledge. By declaring war himself, voluntarily, he created an illusion of control. He was essentially saying, "You didn't drag me into this. I decided to destroy you." But there was another, darker, and more pragmatic reason why he so easily stepped over Article 3, a reason hidden in the cold, gray waters of the Atlantic. The fact is, for German U-boat crews, the war with America had started long before Pearl Harbor, and Hitler knew it perfectly well. If you open school textbooks, they say the U.S. war with Germany began on December 11th. That is the official version. But any German submariner who served in a wolf pack in the autumn of 1941 would have laughed in your face. For them, the war had been going on for months. Roosevelt was in a tight spot. He understood that Nazism had to be stopped, but the American people were categorically against participating in a European slaughter. Isolationism was almost a religion. Mothers from Ohio didn't want to send their sons to die for Danzig or Paris. So the president played his own cunning game. He started an undeclared war at sea. Back in September, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, after an incident with the destroyer USS Greer, which was actually hunting a German sub, Roosevelt issued a secret order to the Navy. It was called Shoot on Sight. Any German submarine spotted in U.S. patrol zones was to be destroyed. Imagine the situation. A neutral country officially orders its ships to sink the fleet of another country. De facto, this is already war, and blood was already spilling. In October 1941, a German torpedo from U-552 broke the American destroyer Reuben James in half. 115 American sailors died in the freezing water. This happened 6 weeks before Pearl Harbor. In any other situation, this would have been grounds for an immediate declaration of war. But Hitler remained silent. This is one of the most amazing paradoxes of that time. Hitler, this rabid aggressor, strictly forbade his admirals from responding to provocations. Admiral Erich Raeder and Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, literally begged the Führer, "Let us sink the Americans. They are guiding British planes onto us. They are dropping depth charges." Hitler said, no. He was terrified of repeating the scenario of World War I. He remembered that it was unrestricted submarine warfare and the sinking of the Lusitania that brought America into Europe in 1917, breaking the back of Imperial Germany. He wanted to delay this moment as long as possible. It was a war where one boxer, the U.S., had his hands free, while the second, Germany, stood blocking with his right hand, tied to his body, afraid to strike back. But on December 7th, everything changed. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Hitler felt relief. He no longer needed to pretend. The mask was off. In his mind, war with the U.S. was inevitable anyway. Roosevelt was already fighting him. So why wait? Why give the Americans time to prepare? Hitler decided it was better to strike now, while the American fleet in the Pacific was burning and the nation was in shock. He wanted to turn the undeclared war into an open slaughter, where his U-boats would have no more restrictions. But in making this decision, he made a fatal error in assessing the enemy himself. Hitler saw the ships, he saw the sailors, but he completely failed to understand what America actually was. His concept of the United States was a collection of stupid, cartoonish cliches. How could a man who had conquered half of Europe be so blind? The answer is simple. Hitler had never been to America. He hadn't seen it with his own eyes. Everything he knew about the U.S. came from Karl May's adventure novels about cowboys, which he read as a child, and Hollywood movies. He viewed America through the lens of King Kong and Mickey Mouse. In his Nazi worldview, America was a mistake of nature. He called the U.S. a mongrel society. In his racial theory, a country where Anglo-Saxons, Italians, Irish, Jews, and African Americans mixed in one melting pot could not be strong. He considered America degenerate. Hitler sincerely believed that Americans were a nation of shopkeepers, that they could make excellent refrigerators, razor blades, and beautiful cars, but were absolutely incapable of fighting and dying. A country that dances to jazz cannot withstand a bayonet charge. That was roughly the reasoning of the Nazi ideologues. It was an astounding, criminal blindness. When intelligence laid reports on his table about the industrial potential of the U.S., Hitler waved them off. He called the steel production figures a Jewish bluff. One of his adjutants recalled how Hitler looked at photos of the Manhattan skyline. Instead of seeing the power of engineering, he saw weakness. He declared that these skyscrapers were simply piles of concrete that would collapse in the first serious wind because Americans had no roots. He was convinced that as soon as the first coffins with American soldiers returned home, U.S. society would fracture, that riots would start, that people softened by democracy would force Roosevelt to sue for peace. It was a denial of reality. Hitler saw only the facade, the glitter of Hollywood and stock market tickers. What he didn't see was Pittsburgh, where blast furnaces were already heating to white-hot intensity. He didn't see Detroit, where assembly lines rolling out family sedans were being converted to tank production in a matter of weeks. He thought he was declaring war on a house of cards. In reality, he had woken up the most powerful industrial machine in human history. But Hitler had one more calculation, a plan to tie America's hands. His great bluff. Hitler was a gambler. His entire career was built on the all-or-nothing principle. In December 1941, he decided to play the biggest hand of his life. His logic was this: the U.S. is a giant but sluggish beast. If Japan forces a brutal war on America in the Pacific now, Roosevelt won't have time for Europe. Hitler looked at the globe. The Pacific Ocean is vast. War there is a logistical nightmare. He calculated that the Japanese fleet would tie up the Americans in combat for years, that U.S. resources would burn in the jungles of the Philippines, not land in Normandy. But there was a second part to this plan, the one he prayed for while looking at the reports from the Eastern Front. He hoped Japan would attack the Soviet Union. In his head, it all fit perfectly, a pincer movement. While the Wehrmacht presses Moscow from the west, the samurai strike Vladivostok and Siberia from the east. Hitler dreamed that those same fresh Siberian divisions, currently grinding down his soldiers near Moscow, would have to be urgently redeployed by Stalin to the Far East. That is why he was in such a hurry to support Japan. He thought, if I declare war on their enemy, America, they will, in gratitude, declare war on my enemy, Russia. It was a deal, quid pro quo, but Hitler misjudged people once again. The Japanese were pragmatists to the bone. They had their own separate non-aggression pact with the USSR, and they had no intention of breaking it. They needed the oil of Indonesia and the rubber of Malaya. They needed warm seas, not the frozen tundra of Siberia. The situation was tragicomic. Germany voluntarily shouldered a war with the world's most powerful economy, the US, to help Japan. And Japan responded with a polite nod. Tokyo did not declare war on the Soviet Union. Not a single Japanese soldier crossed the Manchurian border. Trains carrying Siberian divisions continued rolling west, to Moscow, to kill Germans. The strategic trap had snapped shut. And here we approach the climax. 4 days of silence, from December 7th to the 11th. In these days, the fate of the world was being decided. On December 8th, Roosevelt speaks to Congress with his Day of Infamy speech. He declares war on Japan. America is united. But in this speech, Roosevelt never mentions Germany. The president is tied hand and foot. The people want revenge on the Japanese, not the Germans. If Hitler had simply stayed silent during those days, if he had issued a statement, Germany has nothing to do with Japan's adventures, Roosevelt would have been in a strategic dead end. He would have had to wage war only in the Pacific. But in Berlin, Hitler boards his private armored train, which, by a cruel twist of irony, is named America, and travels to the capital. He is under pressure. On one side, the Kriegsmarine admirals. They are begging for the order to attack. On the other side, Japanese Ambassador Oshima. He comes to Ribbentrop not with a request, but with a demand. Tokyo fears Hitler will make a separate peace with the U.S. The Japanese demand guarantees, signed in blood. Hitler couldn't stand uncertainty. Silence, to him, was weakness. On December 9th, he gives the green light to the U-boats. On December 11th, he steps onto the podium of the Reichstag. 88 minutes of speech. First, boring history. But then, Hitler didn't just declare war on a country. He declared war personally on Franklin Roosevelt. He built his rhetoric on hatred. He, the simple soldier of the people, against the rich kid of the plutocracy. Hitler crossed every line, calling Roosevelt insane and implying that the paralysis of the president's legs had caused paralysis of his brain. Psychologists call this projection. Hitler was attributing his own fears and complexes to his enemy. When he finally declared a state of war, the deputies cheered. But the generals sitting in the hall heard the sound of nails being driven into the coffin of the Reich in those applause. Hitler felt relief. The die was cast. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, what German submariners would call Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time, was already beginning. In mid-January 1942, the war arrived at American shores. Operation Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat. 5 German U-boats approached the U.S. East Coast and saw something incredible. America was living as if the war didn't exist. The Germans expected blackouts. Instead, they saw New York glowing with neon, lighthouses functioning, and resort waterfronts lit up. Against this bright glow, American tankers moved as black, sharp silhouettes. Perfect targets. It wasn't a battle. It was a shooting gallery. U-123, Captain Reinhard Hartigan, recalled being so close to shore, he could see tourists dancing on hotel terraces while his torpedoes tore ships apart. American Admiral Ernest King, out of foolish pride, refused to implement a convoy system. The Navy must attack, not defend, he said. That sentence cost the lives of thousands of sailors. In 6 months, Germans sank nearly 400 ships off the U.S. coast with impunity. That's 2 million tons of cargo. Tankers burned, oil coated the beaches of Florida, and in Berlin, they rubbed their hands together. They thought Hitler was right. America was a paper tiger. But it was an illusion of victory. Operation Drumbeat did the one thing any reasonable strategist fears. It angered the giant. The shock of the losses passed quickly. It was replaced by cold, industrial rage. Neon signs were turned off, and the transformation began. In Detroit, assembly lines for cars stopped. Roosevelt banned civilian production. Hitler considered war an art. Americans turned war into logistics. Look at Henry Ford's Willow Run plant, a giant hangar a mile long. Do you know its pace? 1 B-24 heavy bomber every hour. While a German worker hand-tooled a part for a single plane, America launched an entire Liberty-class ship. The record for assembling a ship was 4 days and 15 hours. Hitler lost the war the moment his calculator broke. He sank 3 million tons, but the U.S. built 10. For every sunken U-boat, Americans responded with 2 new destroyers. German soldiers at the front found chocolate, fresh cigarettes, and letters on fine paper on dead Americans. One Wehrmacht general, seeing a captured U.S. depot, said, "We lost. They have cakes on the front lines, and we don't have gasoline for our tanks." By 1944, the U.S. economy was producing more weapons than the rest of the world combined. Hitler's decision to declare war on the U.S. removed the last political barriers for this flood. He signed the order himself for the production of thousands of bombers that would soon turn Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin into piles of smoking rubble. It was the most expensive mistake in history. A mistake based on pride, racism, and a complete misunderstanding of how the modern world works. Let's go back to that hall in the Kroll Opera House. The lights go out. At that moment, the history of the Third Reich effectively ended. The agony would last another 3 years. There would be millions of victims. But the outcome was decided there. On the night Hitler declared war on America, Winston Churchill in London slept soundly for the first time in a long while. "I slept the sleep of the saved," he would write later. He understood. Britain was no longer alone. Now it had an inexhaustible resource on its side. Historians argue about points of no return. Some say Moscow, others say Stalingrad. But if you look globally, the point of no return was December 11th, 1941. Hitler gave Roosevelt a gift he hadn't dared to dream of. He united his enemies into a single, monolithic fist. In the end, declaring war on the U.S. was not an act of strength. It was an act of escape, an escape from the reality of the failure at Moscow. Hitler decided to set the whole world on fire at once, hoping he could survive in the chaos. He was wrong. When you watch footage from 1945, where Soviet soldiers raise the flag over the Reichstag, or where American tanks drive through the ruins of German cities, remember, this finale didn't start on the battlefields. It started with one speech, delivered by a vain man who thought he could declare war on reality. But reality, in the form of millions of tons of steel and millions of angry people, answered. And that answer wiped his empire off the face of the earth. It took me a lot of time to create this video. Friends, I would be glad if you subscribe to the channel and like it. Let's take the history of the war apart together. See you in the next video.